My Christian friends, today we will, I think, finish with Ephesians and chapter 6. And we'll break it down into two parts, verse 1 to 9, and then the rest. Now, in the last chapter at the beginning, Paul applies the word submission to three human institutions. These institutions and their relationships should be informed by the biblical concept of submission. So let's just review that for a minute. Submission is not a question of authority. I gave the example the other day that if somebody fixes your flat tire at the side of the road because you can't, and they volunteer to fix it, you submit to them because they are going to do something for you you cannot do for yourself. So when a wife submits herself to her husband, he is allowing her to be, amongst other things, her protector. We're talking about the first century here. But Paul could easily say that the husband submits to the wife because she does for him what he cannot do for himself. And this concept runs through the institutions that Paul mentions. The first one is the family, where Paul mentions children and parents. Next, the institution of slavery, where the slave and the master function on the basis of submission. And the emphasis is on the master, who are to treat their slaves in a certain way, and that is as Christ treated the church. So let's read the text to begin with. Paul writes, remember that this was an oral society, not a text society. So this letter, Ephesians, would have had one copy by a scribe, and Paul would have given them the letter and gone over the letter with them, and then they would go and read it, probably over several days, probably many times, and they would discuss it. That's how it worked. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. You'll recognize the Decalogue in here, 10 Commandments. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you, that you may enjoy long life on earth. See what the promise is? Obey your parents, and you'll have a long and enjoyable life. Then the fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. That is so culturally counterculture in an amazing way. This is radical stuff. Now, to start at verse 1 to 4. So here's a discussion of human relationships and how they function best when the spirit of submission and mutuality is present. Paul quotes freely from the Torah, so a brief review is helpful. In the Torah, in Exodus 20, for example, the first four commandments, now the first commandment is actually, I'm the God that led you out of Israel. That's the basis for the commandment. Then he says, the first four commandments of the Decalogue deal with mankind's relationship with God. but the last 6 are concerned with interpersonal relationships. The 5th command centers on the parent-child relationship, where Moses gave parents the task of teaching the commandments to their children as the only way to ensure that the benefits of the covenant will be realized and experienced by the young. However, this important task cannot be done without the child's willingness to listen. The child must submit to the parent because the parent is the only one that can give them what they need. The children are commanded to honor their parents because a proper relationship with God is possible only by means of their parents' instructions. Notice, not the school, the home. This commandment established the family as the primary source of religious instruction in ancient Israel. I wonder if we follow that as Christian families. Most of what Paul says in this paragraph comes directly from the Torah passage. The first reason children should listen to their parents, Paul assumes, is self-evident. It's just simply right. The children owe their parents obedience, or that the children owe their parents obedience is for Paul a matter of natural law. But the child's submission to the authority of the parent is not for the parent's benefit, it is for the child's well-being. The principle of mutuality in all human relationships comes to the fore again in the relationship of parent and child. The parent's authority must be exercised with enough restraint so as not to exasperate or frustrate the child. In this short passage, the focus is not so much on parental authority as much as it is on the responsibility of parents to parent for the benefit of their children. Jordan Peterson says some wise things about parents. He said, the modern parent tries to parent so the child will like them. And he says the modern parent ought to parent their children so that other people like their children. Paul's words, like Peterson, they're very revolutionary. Now we have the institution of slavery. There is a parallel passage in Colossians 3:21 to 4:1. But here we have Ephesians 6:5-9. It's been estimated that there were maybe 60 million slaves in the first century. I don't know if that's accurate, but there was a lot. The institution of slavery was an essential institution in the Roman Empire. And as I said, it's been estimated that there might have been as many as 6 million slaves. Slaves in the southern United States did the back-breaking work that an agricultural society required. But this was not always the case in ancient Rome. The slave in Rome, many of them were much better off than southern slaves. Here, slaves did a much greater variety of work. The elite in Roman society considered labor of any kind beneath their dignity. So work of any kind was done by slaves. Doctors, teachers, property managers, and even secretaries were slaves. The relationship between a slave and an owner could feature loyalty and caring, but for the most part, their life was still difficult. A slave had the same status as a possession. They were nothing more than personal property. Slaves could be bought or acquired through an inheritance. When a slave became seriously ill, the owner had no obligation to bring the slave back to health. A slave unable to do work was bound for the scrap heap. Occasionally, slaves ran away, and when they did, the letter F was branded on their forehead. Usually, capture meant execution, flogging, or some other harsh treatment. Often, slaves committed suicide to avoid the terrible consequences of capture. A slave's life depended upon the whim of his owner, and there are many accounts of slaves being killed for reasons the modern world would consider trivial. This is the context in which Paul wrote this passage, and once again, his message is utterly revolutionary. Now, you can see a fuller treatment of Paul's attitude in the letter of Philemon. It concerns a runaway slave whose name is Onesimus, who he had developed a loving relationship with. In the letter, Paul appealed to Philemon, the slave owner, to accept Onesimus' return as no longer a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. Paul supports his appeal through his willingness to pay for everything that Onesimus might have stolen. Paul did not encourage Onesimus to rebel against the institution because such advice would have been highly impractical. In any case, his letter to Philemon had the effect of attributing full status to Onesimus as a person and a Christian brother. Even though the apostle does not rail against the immorality of slavery, he provided ethical and theological grounds for its ultimate demise. In the Ephesians letter, Paul addresses the slave first, and it is obvious that he is speaking to a Christian slave whose attitude towards his master is governed by his relationship with Christ. He is to perform his duties well, even when the owner is absent, because there is never a time when Christ is not present. The slave is encouraged to regard his work as a service to the Lord, and for this he will be rewarded by God. His reward will be given on the same basis as a free man, because there is no ultimate distinction in the mind of God between the two in his sight. Finally, Paul addresses the slave owner, who is in a position of unrestrained power over his slaves. The slave owner's conscience was the only source of moderation in Roman society. So in its absence, the slave was in a very vulnerable position. What the apostle says in this brief paragraph is highly revolutionary. He insists that three principles be followed. First, in verse 9, Paul admonishes the owner, the Christian owner, to treat your slaves in the same way. He means that just as the slave does his work in the presence of the Lord, so his treatment of the slave is informed also by the presence of the living Lord. Secondly, the owner is forbidden to threaten his slave as a recognition that God regards them as equals, which they were in the church. Thirdly, the owner must treat his slave with the realization that both are equally loved by God. In other words, the owner's treatment of his slave is to be guided by the nature and will of God, not the cultural norms of the day. A radical departure from the cultural norm for sure. Now, it's difficult to know whether Paul thought that what he wrote would one day provide Christians with a reason to oppose slavery as an evil institution. Paul was a man of the first century. He may never have conceived of a time when slavery was not practiced. Marriage and family have also experienced change, but the theological and ethical truths he announced remain true over time and across culture. The ethical question about slavery was never raised by any culture except Christian culture. William Wilberforce, for 30 years, tried to pass an anti-slavery bill in Parliament, and he finally did that. When the founders of the American Constitution wrote, they knew that slavery was wrong. Only in a Christian-based society What's the question of rightness or wrongness asked with respect to slavery? It is part of our past, for sure, but we have made progress because of the Christian gospel. So let's just review some of the truths that Paul has said in this chapter. First one, the promotion of harmonious relationships in society ought to be the desire of every Christian as a recognition that God's ultimate purpose is to reconcile all things. Number two, Christ's relationship to the church is the model for marriage, parenting, master and slave. All human relationships, number three, are sustained by the principle of equality and mutuality. This is from the perspective of heaven. Now next, Paul begins to talk about a new theme, the theme of warfare. Why does Paul think that the church then is in a war? Let me give you a couple of examples that are disgusting. So you know about this leak from the Supreme Court and the damage it's caused with respect to the issue of abortion. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what people say. Yesterday, I watched on TV 5 women discussing this, and the one woman said the following, and I quote, "I would like to find the person who made the link, and I would like to have sweet love with them. And if I got pregnant, we would joyfully abort the child." That was said. Second example, it's even worse. And every time I've told this story, I tear up. I'll try not to. There was a protest, illegal by the way, outside the house of Alito, Justice Alito, one of the conservative judges they blame for canceling abortion, which they didn't do, actually. There was a woman in the crowd that came to the front of the crowd, and she had stuff stuffed in here to make her look pregnant. And in there was a little doll. She sat down on the sidewalk, and she pretended to deliver the baby. So she took it out from between her legs. She tore the head off the doll and slammed it repeatedly against the sidewalk. Yeah, we're in a war, all right. And it's about time we started to fight it, in my opinion, especially me. So here's what Paul says, and he uses the metaphor of the armor and various kinds of armors, all which represent some theological truth. So here are his words. "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, it's now, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand firm. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, and the breastplate of righteousness in its place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Pray also for me, that whenever I speak, words may be given to me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I, Paul, am an ambassador in chains. He's in prison. Pray that I may declare it fearlessly, as I should, and as we should. The apostle brings his letter to a forceful conclusion by warning them that there are battles to be fought against a very determined enemy. The enemy we face now is wokeism, in my opinion. Victory is assured, but many battles are still to be fought, and in the face of this reality, the Ephesians must not become passive onlookers. They must become soldiers. Therefore, Paul calls them to a life of active resistance against the devil's schemes. I wonder, are we prepared for our cultural battle? From now until the Lord returns, we will be at war, so we need to get battle ready, just as the Ephesians. Now, Paul began his letter with a theological discourse that contained the wondrous story of God's accomplishment through his incarnate Son. God has formed in them a new humanity. Jews and Gentiles are formed into a single body as a sign that God will ultimately reconcile the entire universe under the lordship of Christ. Furthermore, Paul has carefully reminded them that the entire community that has been reconciled to God in precisely the same way, irrespective of their religious or cultural background. He has taught them of their calling to live in a harmonious relationships as children of the light. Humility, meekness, patience, and love are the essential characteristics of the new humanity, and submission to each other is its mode of worship. Paul knew, as we know, that they could not live their lives cloistered in the church. They were called to live as a counterculture in a hostile world that would attack them regularly. By living in a cultural manner, they will be taking up Israel's task of rescuing the entire creation. Defeat, when it happens, would not be a debilitating threat as long as they align themselves with the strength and power of God by dressing in the armor he provides. Verse 11, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. You see, a soldier declares his willingness to fight by putting on armor. And Paul goes on to describe what the armor is. The enemy, Paul describes, is mysterious, unseen, and it is everywhere. It is an enemy bent on creating disharmony everywhere in creation by using human institutions and invisible forces as its instrument. That's verse 12. The threat is so serious that Paul, like a drill sergeant, barks out his orders for a second time. Therefore, put on the whole armor of God, so when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. Verse 13. The word Paul used for armor was an everyday Greek word, and this word referred to a complete set of equipment used by the most heavily armed infantry soldiers. The apostle mentions all 6 pieces separately, beginning with the soldier's belt, which is the belt of truth. Paul's language from the prophet Isaiah throughout this passage. Isaiah said in 57, he put on righteousness as his breastplate and the helmet of salvation on his head. The soldier's belt was not actually part of his armor, but it performed an essential function, just as important as the armor itself. Roman soldiers wore a loose-fitting cloak under the armor, which could become entangled when they ran. So they tightened the belt buckle tightly. It gathered up the loose cloth and allowed the soldier to move freely. Now the apostles' meaning can be understood. Without the support of truth, the Christian is unable to move enough to defeat the enemy. Our belt is the belt of truth, and truth allows us to run freely and confidently. Notice that Paul wrote the belt of truth rather than the belt of the truth. The absence of the definite article gives us the key to what he meant. The truth would mean the gospel itself, whereas truth without a definite article is most likely a reference to the soldier's personal integrity and sincerity. Paul is far too realistic to think that the Ephesians were capable of moral and spiritual perfection. He is, however, telling them that they could win battles simply by being transparently honest and sincere in all their dealings and relationships, the belt of truth. Next, the breastplate of righteousness. At least two interpretations are possible. The Newer Testament word Paul used is a Greek word, and for the most part it referred to the gracious gift of God whereby men and women are brought into right relationship to him by faith in Christ's atoning death. Gift rather than merit was the basis on which God had reconciled the Ephesians. Christ bore the consequences of their sins, and his righteousness has been given to them a new status, so it follows that righteousness worn as a breastplate would protect them in the heat of battle, because they would be able to fight the enemy, secure in the knowledge that the enemy's blows were incapable of separating them from the love of God. The attack of the enemy may come as a subtle ambush on their inner confidence. The enemy will try to cast doubt on their status as forgiven sinners in an effort to force retreat. Wearing the breastplate would remind them that the atoning death of Christ has been entirely adequate. The devil's attacks would be repelled by the knowledge that they have been pardoned totally and made into a new humanity. Thirdly, Paul tells the Ephesians to put the right boots on. There is an agreement amongst several commentators that the apostle had in mind a particular kind of half boot called a caliga. These leather boots had soles with studs that enabled the soldiers to secure a solid footing in battle. The Christian soldiers are told to equip their feet with the equipment of the gospel of peace. The word equipment comes from the Greek word, which means to be prepared or ready. Scholars say that there is an ambiguity in the Greek grammar that allowed for two different meanings. Just as a soldier's boots provide solid footing, so the gospel gives the Christian the solid footing he or she needs to fight the principalities and powers. Another meaning is also possible that is favored by the Anglican evangelical scholar John Stott. He believes that the soldier's footwear is his readiness to announce the good news. If the second translation is favored, then Paul is telling them that a good soldier is one who is constantly prepared to preach the gospel. A soldier is not one who loads his gun when the enemy begins his attack. He understands that the importance of constant readiness, so his gun, metaphorically speaking, is always locked and loaded. That's verse 15. The shield is the fourth item the soldier needs to be victorious, and in this case, it is the shield of faith, verse 16. Paul is referring to a long, oblong shield that is able to protect the entire body, and it was designed particularly to resist flaming darts. The enormous size of the shield of faith is needed to protect the soldier from the devil's most dangerous and powerful weapons. When these attacks come, the Christian soldier will be able to thrust in the power of God that assures the final victory. Two pieces of equipment remain, the helmet and the sword. The helmet is a helmet of salvation. Salvation refers to the soldier's experience of being forgiven for past sins, the power of the Spirit that enables the soldier to gain victory over present sins, and the assurance that his salvation will be perfected in the future. The soldier's protection is the inner knowledge that God will finally be victorious over Satan and that he will be included in the winning side. The first 5 pieces provide protection, but the sword allows the soldiers to go on the offensive. The sword or dagger is a two-edged and meant for close encounters of various kinds. It is short and good for fighting in close hand-to-hand combat. He calls it the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Because it is the sword of the Spirit, it is able to examine the conscience, strengthen it, and subdue its sinful purposes. The sword of the Spirit is a weapon effective enough to resist the devil's temptation, even during the most intense hand-to-hand combat. What a wonderful promise in verse 17. And now the concluding remarks of Paul in 18 to 24. Now remember that Paul began his letter by asking the Ephesians to express their gratitude to God in prayer. The apostle himself prayed regularly, expressing his thanks for the work that God was doing to form the new humanity in them. Now, at the close of his letter, Paul returns to the subject of prayer, but not for the purpose of thanksgiving. Prayer, he says, is as essential to warfare as a full set of armor. He writes that they must pray in the Spirit, expecting them to know what he means by this phrase. It is unlikely that Paul was referring to ecstatic prayer because there is nothing in the context of the situation that would suggest the relevance of speaking in another language. Praying in the Spirit probably means to pray with one's will aligned with the purpose of God, just as a soldier fights according to the plan of his general. Another possibility is that Paul is reassuring them that God does not limit his response to the actual words they use. He looks at the heart. He looks past the words, and he recognizes the deep longings and the needs they are unable to express. Paul adds the phrase, at all times with all prayer and supplication, because a good soldier prays unceasingly in a variety of ways for the benefit of his fellow soldiers. The soldier must pray with one eye open and keep awake. Prayer is not the occasion when the soldier puts aside the realities of the battle. The Christian soldier needs to know when the devil is fashioning a counterattack on his conscience in an effort to destroy the unity of the church, or fool the individual soldier into lowering his guard so his evil darts can't find the point of vulnerability. Verse 18. The apostle freely admitted that he was in need of their prayers because he was also a prisoner awaiting trial. Actually, he wants them to pray that he will be able to preach openly, and the word he uses is parousia. The dictionary of Greek New Testament words defines the meaning of the word as outspokenness, frankness, plainness of speech that conceals nothing and passes over nothing. The word provides the speaker with courage and confidence, boldness, fearlessness, especially in the presence of men of high rank. Finally, Paul calls himself an ambassador in chains, and he wants them to pray for his freedom. Freedom could mean that he wants the opportunity to preach even while he is a prisoner, or even better, that he should win his freedom in Caesar's court. In the second last paragraph, Paul mentions Tychicus, his companion, messenger, and possible transcriber. On his visit, he will fill them in on any information that is not included in the letter. And Paul expects Tychicus' personal knowledge of Paul will be a means of encouragement. The letter is concluded as Paul wishes for them the 3 essentials of peace, love, with faith, and grace. So ends our study of Ephesians. It's just the beginning. You can spend a lot of time on the letter and see things that I didn't notice. So God bless you. And if you've listened to all these expositions, I'm very grateful. See you again.